Welcome to the Strategic Leader Podcast with me, Gemma Bullivant, and my co-host, Fiona Craig. This podcast is for HR professionals and people-focused leaders from any function who want to think, act, and feel naturally more strategic. Enjoy the show. Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Hi, Fee. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks, Gem. And you?
Yes, I'm doing very well, thank you. So, what's been your strategic focus this week? How have you been strategic this week?
Well, strategically, and in fact, any other measure as well, I've been a bit poorly. I've just had a stinking cold. And so I felt really sorry for myself. And I guess the thing that I really had to think strategically about was self-care. You know, we talk about different levels of fitness, and I have to be intellectually fit, and I have to be kind of professionally fit, and I have to be physically fit, but I also have to be emotionally fit to work with coachees and to work with teams. And I recognize when I'm under the weather, I just haven't got that. It just takes me too long to recover. And I guess in the olden days, I would sit in my bed and I'd just bravely soldier on, and I'd be firing out emails and trying to talk to people, feeling really under the weather. And I think finally, as I'm settling into my 50s, recognizing if I'm ill, I just need to get better. And stringing it out is actually not the best long-term goal. So this week, probably for the first time ever, I just went, do you know what? I'm ill. I'm just going to sleep. I'm just going to lie down. I'm not going to be brave. I'm not going to try and do some work. I'm just going to, let myself be ill and then let myself get better. And that's what happened. And I feel so much better this week. But I do wonder whether there is something strategic in just get better. You're not going to get better by trying to work. So that's a bit of a new one and perhaps not an expected answer to your question. But how about you? How have you been a strategic leader in the last week?
I think, hearing what you've just said, I'm praying that I maintain good health at least for the next few weeks, because I'm in that frenzy that I'm sure we can all relate to, which is trying to pack as much work in as is humanely possible before I go on an almost 2-week holiday.
Yes.
And my dear mum used to say, you don't get holiday, you just get permission to leave your desk. And by that, she meant that the same volume of work exists, but you just have to squeeze it into a shorter space of time.
That's very true. That's true. That's very true.
Really relating to that at the moment. So from a strategic standpoint, I would say if we were going to look at how much time I'm spending on the balcony and how much time I'm spending on the dance floor, I am dancing my little socks off, and that's all I'm doing.
Well, and you're a great dancer. I can vouch for that. So, there's no issue. But it's interesting, isn't it? Saying actually what I need to do right now is be tactical. But that's not a sustainable way to approach things for the long term. And at least you have got a holiday. You will take a break and the rhythm will change.
Absolutely. And holidays are often a bit of a punctuation mark, aren't they? And I feel certain that I will come back from holiday similar to other times I've been away, where the rhythm, the speed, the pace has somewhat shifted. And for a small few days or weeks, we can enjoy not being in the fast lane, but we can be in one of the slower lanes just for a moment until it inevitably ends up in the fast lane again. So, yeah, that's been my experience. Now, we are in series 3 of this podcast, and it's all about relationships. So what aspect of relationship are we focusing on today, Fee?
Well, we're talking about a key relationship. Fundamentally, we're talking about your relationship with your line manager. Obviously, whenever we talk about stuff like this, there'll be ideas and learnings that you can apply to people that you line manage to, or indeed other people that you're just interacting with. But we want to specifically talk about your relationship with your manager. How do you manage your manager? And I guess the bulk of our conversation rests on the assumption that you have a reasonable working relationship with your line manager. We're not talking about high conflict situations here. That might be the stuff of a different episode. So let's assume that, broadly, you are able to operate in a reasonable capacity with your manager. But there are always ways that we can do things better. There are always ways we can do things more efficiently. There are things we can learn about each other that help us work together better, get to better outcomes more quickly and more easily without sort of going around the houses. And often this notion of managing your manager is quite a new one to people. We kind of make some assumptions about our managers, don't we? We make the assumption that, well, they're more senior than us. They may have more years under their belt in the job than we do. And we make the assumption sometimes that this person is a sort of a great authority, a great sort of wise person, and behave accordingly. And that's not always the most helpful way of going about it. And what we want
Oh.
to talk about today is a model that we've both found to be really useful when it comes to thinking about relationships, especially as you reach the top of your department, the top of your company, even, and the relationships you're having may well still be your line manager, but you're both senior peers, right? You're shifting into perhaps the second half of your career, and you are both seniors.
Mm,
You've got different levels. There may be org charts and whatever that put you at different levels. That's kind of not the point. The point is you're both adults and you've both got a lot of experience. You both know what you're talking about. How do you manage that relationship with this key
mm,
person?
mm, mm. So it's really about optimizing the relationship that we have with our manager and holding on to that concept of good to great, perhaps. It may not even be good. It may just be average, but but to your point, we're not necessarily talking about really toxic relationships. I'd say that's definitely a topic in its own right for us to consider. But whether your relationship with your manager is a very strong, positive experience or whether it's less so, I think there are things that we can examine in today's conversation that will perhaps help to unpack a little bit of that and give you some ideas for how to improve that relationship for mutual benefit.
Absolutely. And if we think about what we need our managers for, broadly falls into a few camps. We need them to guide us and advise us. We need them to help us sometimes. We may need them as a sounding board, just as a kind of thinking partner. We may need them to approve things for us. They may literally be in some sort of approval status. We may also need to influence more broadly via them. We may need to take ideas, proposals, and so on to more senior stakeholders via our manager. So we might need to equip them with the information that they need in order to get things done on our behalf. So all of these things can be sped up, can be made smoother, can be made more efficient. I like the word you used, optimized, by simply thinking about, what do I need from this person and what does this person need from me? This is a two-way thing. How can we acknowledge what both sides need and what both of our preferences are in order to get the best possible outcome?
So, what manager relationship is coming to your mind, Fee, as you're explaining that? Have you got any examples you might be able to share?
I've got a small example, but it was a really powerful one for me, and it was with my old CEO called James, who I had a huge amount of respect and time for. But I think that initially we had a slight clash of approaches in that if I was trying to get him to agree to something, I would make my case and then I would remake my case and then I'd pile a few more arguments on the top and then I'd provide a little bit more evidence and then I'd pile on a hefty dollop of enthusiasm and I would just keep plugging away at this idea and on the expectation, the hope that any minute he would just say, yes, that sounds like a great idea, let's do it. And it always used to worry me that I didn't get that, yes, what a great idea, let's go right ahead. And I found that I was having to persuade and persuade and persuade. And the more I persuaded, more reluctant he became. The more reluctant he became, the more I persuaded. And it suddenly occurred to me when I was watching him with somebody else, I am not allowing for the fact that he is an introvert. It means he likes to do his thinking on the inside of his head in this kind of context. He just likes a little bit of clear air. So if I
Mm.
had given him my first argument, James, I think we should do X because A, B, and C. And if we don't do it, we'll probably end up with situation C. And literally left it at that. Given him a moment of silence, just a pause, a moment for him to chew over what I'd said, a moment for him to ask me any questions that he was interested in, he probably would have said straight away, yes, let's do it. But I didn't twig. It took me ages to twig that he needed something different from me. I needed an immediate and enthusiastic yes, and he wasn't going to give me that. He needed a bit of airtime, a bit of thinking space, a moment of silence, a pause in which he could just chew it over
Mm,
before he said yes. And it wasn't just me. I remember watching somebody else doing it and then having a word with her afterwards and saying, "This is what I have found works with James. If you want something from him, give him the basics and then just literally sit in silence." That can be one of the hardest things we do. But somebody else is thinking, and if we're talking, we're interrupting their thinking. So just give him that thinking time, and I bet you he'll come back with a yes. And that's what she tried, and lo and behold, that's what happened. But it was just about thinking, I'm a bit over enthusiastic about this. I'm excited. I'm enthused. I want to persuade you. So I'm piling all this stuff on when
mm,
really what I should have done was just sit with that
mm.
uncertainty for a moment and let him do his thinking. So that's a small example of me kind of thinking, what do I need to give you in order for you to say yes to me? It wasn't like I was conning him into saying yes, but giving him a bit of a moment to get to yes by himself. Very powerful thing.
Absolutely. And that's calling to mind a lot of the themes that we'd covered in episode 1 of this series, which is more generally about other people, not necessarily somebody more senior to us. But in all cases, it's universal, isn't it? We need to pay attention to what the other person needs. And I wonder if perhaps in the scenario of a manager, we can fall into the trap of making an assumption that they know the answer, or they're right and we're wrong if they disagree, or that authority question in some way complicates the relationship or muddies the water a little bit.
There's an element of power in there when we think about
Mm,
people who are more senior than us. And that can cast a shadow because we grow up with all kinds of stories about power, assumptions about power. Our parents have power over us, our teachers have power over us. And it can be very easy to get into the workplace and assume our bosses have power over us. I've heard many, many times people say, well, I can't ask my boss that because they'll think I don't know, or I can't ask my boss for help because they'll think I'm not capable of doing it. And there's a sort of assumption that if they are powerful, then I am powerless. And
yeah.
I don't, I, I would like us to think in terms of equal power. We both have an equal right to be in this conversation.
Yes, yes. Now that is really calling to my mind one of my all-time favorite psychological models.
Can
Bet
I
you
guess
didn't
what it
expect
is?
me to say that in one sentence.
My all-time favorite psychological models. Do you have those in your handbag when you're on the dance floor?
Yeah, yeah. I can sell to the party, me. This is the parent, adult, child model. I often refer to it when we've got a conflict situation, but it's actually a very relevant model in what we're describing here, which is more to do with power and authority and subservience. So the parent, adult, child model comes from transactional analysis and Dr. Eric Byrne. If you don't know it, it's super simple. Again, we'll put lots of information in the show notes for you to refer to. But what it's saying is that at any given time when we're in an interaction, we're assuming a role, and the role could either fall within the category of parent, where we are either the authority, or perhaps we may even be a more smothering or nurturing sort of micromanager type version of parent. Or we're a child, which is usually what happens when one person is parent, the other person goes into child. And that child's either very subservient, very obedient, does as they're told, tries to people please, or maybe they're a rebellious sort of tantrum toddler type version of that child mode. And what happens in lots of relationships is that we're in one or other mode. And if you think about some interactions you've had recently, perhaps that you've experienced with your manager or with people in your team or other people, if it hasn't gone particularly well, or at least not as well as you would have liked it to have gone, it could be that you were in one of these modes. Because what we really want to be in is adult to adult mode. Adult to adult mode is where we consider ourselves as equals. So, regardless of what that org chart says about who's more senior than the other, there is a wider context of knowing your stuff enough to actually be validly turn up as an adult in that conversation with that manager. That manager doesn't know everything. That manager isn't necessarily the complete wise sage of all things. And they need to come and meet you as an adult, and you need to meet them as an adult. I've absolutely powered through that model there. Do you want to ask me any questions
Well,
about
I'm thinking that so what we're saying then, if I've understood correctly, is that there are 3 positions we could be in some sort of conversation or some relationship with somebody. We could be kind of equal adult to adult, which is rational, aware, curious, just sort of generally interested in that other person and happy and comfortable standing my own ground, but also interested in your ground. We can be in a parent situation, which is when I'm telling you off or telling you what to do, or maybe guiding you or hovering over you or sort of otherwise interfering in a kind of I know best sort of way. Or I can be in a child, which could show up as a oh yes, I'll absolutely, you're the manager, I'll do whatever you say. Yes, my manager said this, therefore it has to be true. Or if I think about myself, a bit of a stroppy child. If someone tells me what to do, I can think that I have been a bit of a stroppy, rebellious child and kind of gone down the whole, well, I'm not going to do it now because you bloody told me off. And actually using that language, you sometimes can get a sense of where we are, because these can be quite subtle positions, can't they? But you can get a sense of where you are by listening to the language. So we might hear somebody say, oh, I need to tell off someone in my team because they haven't done something right. And
Mm.
that's the language of kind of parent child, I'm telling you off. Or I've just got a ticking off because I did X or Y, which is kind of putting yourself in a child's position, and then or thereby forcing the other party into a parent position. And it's about thinking, hold on a sec, is there something parent childy about what's going on here between us in one way or the other?
Mm.
And can we possibly get out of that and into adult to adult, isn't it? The adult to adult position is a better place to end up.
The adult to adult position is certainly the optimum position. If we're thinking about optimizing our relationships, we need to spend as much time as possible in the adult to adult space. And we need to be on the lookout for when we might be sent in one of the other roles for whatever reason, because what tends to happen almost instinctively is that if one person adopts one of the roles, parent or child, the other person adopts the opposite role.
Well, I just thought that when I was talking then, which is if somebody does get a little bit authoritative with me and a bit of a kind of, this is what you have to do, I will instinctively go to stroppy child.
Mm.
Although I don't wish to be there as a, as an adult, I wouldn't choose to be there, but I can feel that that's where I would go sometimes if I was put in that position.
So, how would you approach in that scenario if somebody's approached a conversation with you to the extent, given you a bit of a telling off or told you in no uncertain terms what they want and need, and you're finding yourself going into that stroppy child mode? What would you say would be a good thing to do to try to get both of you back into adult to adult?
I guess the first thing is never say to somebody you're acting like a child because that would, or indeed like a parent, because nobody wants
Mm.
to hear that, right? So this is not a kind of, oh, you're behaving like a child, get into adult mode. The world is much more subtle than that. And you can really only manage your own response, can't you? But I guess that's the key, isn't it? Notice the response. Notice, oh, I have been a little bit triggered here into stroppy child. There's something going on here. I noticed that I've gone a bit prickly. I've gone a bit stroppy. You've said something that's pissed me off, and I'm responding to that. I mean, and I would literally use these words because I use this quite a lot. If I was an adult, if I was a grown up, how would I wish to respond now? And that just gives you that sense to say, okay, I'm not a stroppy child. I'm an adult woman. And like you say, I am an equal partner in this conversation. So you may have a more senior job title than me, but if we're having a conversation about something to do with work, then I am an equal partner in that conversation. So if I was behaving like an adult, how would I behave? I would probably lower my voice. I would probably speak more slowly. I would probably go, okay, let's just check in with what we're trying to achieve here. I would probably ask, what's going on for them, bring some curiosity to bear, get out of judgment mode, get some curiosity going on, which is what's happening here. Where do we need to get back on some safe common ground? But you can only do that once you've noticed what's going on. Hopefully, if you step into that adult space, if I am able to get myself out of child and back into adult, that can be enough to encourage the other person to do the same. They can just
Yes.
feel the reset. They can feel the kind of, hold on a second, let's just be grown-ups about this. And I know, I really do know, don't say those words, but just
Mm,
think about it. Okay, if I
absolutely.
show up as an adult, if I feel like an adult, if I behave and speak, that intention will come across and be felt by the
Mm.
other person, and they will most likely respond in kind.
Yeah, that's excellent. And one of the things about this is that the parent mode and the child mode, both of them are emotional in nature. The
Yeah.
adult mode is predominantly rational in nature. And so what you've just described there in terms of what would an adult do here is is almost it's like a little portal in your mind to taking yourself away from the emotion of the situation to help your brain recalibrate this on a rational level. So if your manager is losing their temper and therefore adopting a bit of a parent mode in terms of that authority parent, for example, allowing that emotion to just not be met with more emotion from your side, and remember, emotion is also upset, distress, those
Mm.
sorts of things as well. But instead, allow enough space and distance to just let that settle if that's what's needed. But then, maybe quite calmly and quite rationally, being a bit more curious with that person and saying, okay, tell me exactly what you need here. Not in a stroppy, "Tell me
Mm.
what you need and I'll just do it." That's different to, "Help me to understand how I can do this in a way that were hoping for and that you need." You can see the difference in the way that that is positioned, that takes it from an emotional response to a rational response. And I think the key to getting into adult to adult space is, first of all, as you've said, just notice it and remind yourself, what would an adult do in this scenario? And then step into the most rational space that you can possibly muster to allow that person enough of an opportunity to meet you back on a rational level.
Yeah, so it's modeling that adult behavior,
Mm.
and I mean, that's a great technique for all of the relationships, because let's not forget, if you're experiencing this with your manager, then other people could well be experiencing similar things with you. So all of this stuff applies to people that you might line manage, and indeed people that you might just encounter, peers that you might encounter.
Mm.
So we can ask ourselves the question, are there any relationships that we have across our business that are more parent-child or child-parent than adult to adult? Now, sometimes you need a bit of parent-child. Like if you're mentoring somebody, that relationship specifically is about, I am here to help you. But there's still an element of but you're still taking responsibility for your own learning and development. It's still adult to adult because one party is taking control and responsibility for their own professional development, and they're seeking out help and support for somebody who has some advice and some knowledge in that area. So even in a learning and development and mentoring and training people up environment, I may be imparting knowledge to you, but you are still taking responsibility for what you do with that knowledge. So it can still be quite adult to adult. It's not patronizing, it's not patronizing or disempowering. So
Mm.
just think, have you got any relationships kicking around the business that you think have an element of patronizing? Either you are being patronized or you are patronizing to someone else.
That's
And
a
just
really good
consider
question.
what's going on in those relationships and what needs to happen to shift them a little bit. towards adult to adult, particularly if that person is your line manager.
So, in the example that you gave earlier, Fee, with the CEO, what would you say was going on there if we were to look at the parent, adult, child
Mhm.
model?
Well, it's an interesting one because it's quite subtle, isn't it? I think if I was to describe myself in those moments, and it used to happen relatively regularly, I would have described myself as perhaps an over enthusiastic puppy. I got an idea, a new toy. I was very keen to action my new idea, my new toy, and I was very keen just for him to rubber stamp it and go, "Yep, Fee, off you go. Crack on, sounds great. Off you go." That's what I wanted. So perhaps I don't think of myself as being a child, but I would think of myself as being a puppy, which is probably the same thing in terms of what we're thinking about. And in a way, I was almost forcing him into a parent role. Whereas if I had said, "Here's my idea, James, what do you need to process that idea?" If
Yeah,
I could have sat with the discomfort of him not saying anything for a couple of minutes, if I could have said, "Here's my idea, James, what do you need? Do you want me to go away and you think about it?"
yeah,
Then I would have got my answer, and probably I'd have got a yes much more quickly. So it's nothing to do with the quality of the idea, it's just the approach that I was taking. I was perhaps coming at it from too childlike a perspective. If I'd and then I learned, right, come at it from a more adult perspective. I've got an idea. When is it best for you to hear it?
So I think to wrap up, what we're saying here is that there's all of the things that we covered in an earlier episode with working with others more effectively, generally speaking, what's their perspective, what's their natural style, what are they most going to respond to? So do they like detail? Do they want action? Do they want big picture? Are they an introverted thinker or an extroverted thinker? To use today's example, your CEO sounded like they just needed a bit of space to process internally and didn't
Yep.
need to actually talk that through externally. But an extroverted thinker would very comfortably explore things more verbally and more on the spot. Overlaying that with the concept of when is this power dynamic getting in the way or complicating the relationship that we would otherwise be looking at in the previous episodes. And thinking about that authority dynamic, perhaps using the ideas that we've shared in the parent, adult, child model, where sometimes that can just quite instinctively happen. And the moment one person assumes the authority role, the other person, which is the parent, the other person assumes the lower authority role, which is the child. And actually, what we need to do is get onto that equal adult to adult.
So, a useful model there that you can take into your relationship with your manager. You can also bear in mind when you're managing people in your own team and think about indeed any relationship. It's actually really helpful in your personal relationship, I think sometimes. That's such a great model. I'm so glad you have it as your personal favorite psychological model. There's lots
Yeah,
in there.
I'll be asking you about your list of favorites.
My favorite psychological model. All right, well I'll have one for you next time.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I hope you found some of that useful, and we will see you again next time.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to access more of our recordings. And if you think it'd be useful for someone else, please forward to them and leave a review. We base our content on questions we are regularly asked and what you want to know more about, so please do email us with any questions or comments to gemma@gemmabullivant.co.uk. And remember, you're already being more strategic than you realise.